the next section, after we've discussed what ecosystems are and then subsequently how energy comes into the ecosystem and how it flows through the ecosystem. After we've discussed those things, we next move on to start looking at climate change. What's the evidence for it? And then at the end of the topic, what is the impact of climate change? Okay, so let's begin. 5.3 is really all about the evidence. What is the evidence for climate change? That's what 5.3 is all about. We begin with this discussion of the types of evidence. So if we look at it like a hierarchical tree of evidence, there's two main types of evidence that you could have. There's anecdotal, which is not really useful. Okay, it's essentially references to things just from people's memories or people's recollections, just kind of noted down in diaries or books or whatever format. But these are not scientific. They are not actual temperature measurements. It's just reliant on people's memories, people's perceptions, and so on. So that's not reliable. And we kind of contrast that with scientific evidence. So obviously this is going to form the basis of 5.3. What is that scientific evidence? There's three main types of evidences that you could have for climate change. The first being temperature records. So actual temperature measurements made with temperature recording devices which are accurate, and then those temperatures recorded over time. The other way is by doing what's called a pollen analysis in peat bogs. I will explain that if that's not making sense. And then finally we have dendrochronology. Again, I will also explain that. It's to do with tree growth. And something that's not really measuring climate per se, but something to do with the climate is ice cores. And we'll discuss a little bit about that as well. But these are the types of scientific evidence that you can use to at least do the analysis of whether or not temperature, climatic conditions have changed over time in the past. And then based on that data, we try to do an extrapolation, but then that takes us to another section. So we've got a summary here of the different ways of recording or finding evidence for climate change. Temperature records is basically what it says on the tin. Temperature has been recorded using specialized instrumentation over time, and then those records have been kept to see whether the temperature has been changing over time. Okay. With regards to peat bogs, the idea is that peat bogs have very anaerobic and acidic conditions. Okay, and these conditions prevent plant material from being decayed, okay, and decomposed. So what we said earlier was, remember that if there's any kind of organic material in an ecosystem, there are organisms that are there which break that material down. However, in peat bogs, the conditions are so anaerobic, so without oxygen, and so acidic that in many cases, plant material like pollen has been laid down or just fallen down on the ground, and it does not decompose, and it gets preserved for a long, long period of time. Okay, so you can dig these cores out of the ground. Okay, So say you dig these cores out of the ground, okay, and then you basically spread them out, okay, and then as you kind of take samples from different places, what you're doing is sampling the soil from back in time. So if this was the top of the core right there, if we take a soil sample from here, that might have been just maybe 100 years ago. Okay, so soil from 100 years ago. However, the deeper and deeper we go in that core, so if we get to the bottom right here, we might be looking at 1,000 years ago, soil from 1,000 years ago. And what you're doing is you're looking at the types and amount of pollen from different periods in history in this area. So we analyze the pollen, and maybe here we find, you know, lots of pollen from species A and B. So 1,000 years ago there was lots of pollen from species A and B. And if you analyze the pollen from only 100 years ago, then we might find that there's a lot of species C and D here. Okay, so what we have to do then is to say, right, species A, what are the climatic, and if we're being kind of extra smart, we would say, what are the abiotic factors that species A and B are adapted to? You know, so we would find that, all right, species A and B, so we would know the growth conditions that species A and B prefer. So we simply infer that if we know that species A and B prefer dry and maybe humid conditions, maybe warm, so we know that if there's more pollen from species A 1,000 years ago, then the conditions were these, or closer to this. Whereas 100 years ago, we found more pollen from species C and D and less pollen from species A and B. And so, because we know that species C and D, for example, they prefer the conditions of wetter, possibly colder, and because we know that, then we can infer that about 100 years ago, the conditions in this area were wetter and colder. And so we can see that from 1,000 years ago to 100 years ago, the climate has changed from these conditions to these conditions. Okay, so the good thing is that even though it's not as precise, you might say, or as accurate, even though we don't have that, we do have information that is going back a very long way. And that can sometimes be more useful than very accurate records that don't perhaps go back as long. Let's talk about dendrochronology then. Dendrochronology works on a similar idea. However, it doesn't have quite as much of the drawback as peat bog analysis in regards to the timing. Okay, so simply put, every year, you know, we looked at the stems. In topic 4, we looked at the stems of plants, and we looked at these vascular bundles. Okay, and what we said was that in a stem, the vascular bundle is arranged in a ring around the, throughout the stem. Okay, and that in these vascular bundles, remember, they contain xylem, phloem, sclerenchyma. Yeah. However, the thing is that every year, we have a new layer of these vascular bundles produced. Okay, every year we get a new layer of these vascular bundles produced by the process of mitosis, and new kind of xylem is produced every year, producing a new ring every year. Okay. So what we have is, if you cut the trunk of a tree, which is effectively the stem, or extrapolates to it, you find these rings which correspond to the annual addition of a new layer of xylem cells, for example, or xylem tissue. Okay, so each year, each ring corresponds to a year of growth. Each ring corresponds to a year of growth, and more importantly than that, depending on the conditions, you will get thicker rings where there's presumably more growth, and thinner rings. Okay, so thicker rings indicate more growth, thinner rings indicate less growth. And again, similar to the peat bog analysis, if we know the species, if we know the tree species, we know the growth conditions that these species prefer. Known growth conditions. So we know the conditions that they like, so we can infer that, if there was a particular year where there was a very thick layer of growth, then we infer that the climatic conditions were close to those ideal conditions that this species prefers. If there was thin rings or perhaps no rings for a particular year, then we know that the growth conditions were tending away from that. So, different from ideal growth conditions. And whereas with pollen analysis we are effectively estimating the dates and the years, well, not the dates, but we're effectively estimating how much back in time the depth corresponds to by using carbon dating, with tree ring analysis, as long as the date, if the date of the cutting is known, as long as the date of the cutting is known, we can then extrapolate quite accurately how many years it has been, or the time period that is covered by the rings. So if we knew that the date of cutting, for example, was 1901, for example, so the date that this tree was cut was, or the year that was 1901, and let's just say we can count 30 rings, then we know that exactly which time period was covered, or exactly which time period the climatic information is about. Yeah, so the 30 years preceding 1901. Okay, and it wouldn't be just this one. Presumably we would have other samples from a similar area which we could use to kind of increase the reliability of the estimates. But that is the principle, that we use the analysis of the rings to tell us how much growth there was, and we use the information about the species of tree that we are looking at to tell us whether those growth conditions were close to the optimum conditions that this species prefers, or not those conditions. Okay, so that is that. Now they all have their advantages and disadvantages, but you can infer some of those, or go through the book for those. Okay, now this is the kind of example that you might have to contend with. So this is showing changes in abundance. So this is a depth. So this is a peat bog analysis sample right here, and we are looking at the abundance of pollen types from different trees going across here. Okay, and the abundance is shown on the graph below. Obviously the depth is corresponding to time, so this is more recent right here, and this is the distant as we go deeper. So we can see that in the distant past, the most abundant pollen type was birch, right here. Okay, so the most abundant pollen type was from birch, and so birch trees must have been very common in the distant past. We would use carbon dating to give us an idea about when that distant past was, but that's what we would infer from this, and knowing the growth conditions that the birch species prefer, we would then infer that those conditions were around in the distant past. As we go lower in the depth, so as we move this way through the depth, going towards the more recent past, we see that the amount of pollen from birch went down, and the abundance of pollen from oak and alder increased. So whatever the conditions are that oak and alder prefer, they are the conditions that are found in the more recent past. That's how we would analyze this. Next, we will move on to the possible causes for climate change. So if the evidence shows that climate change is occurring, we now look at some of the reasons for those changes. So, advantages and disadvantages. If we look at temperature records, the advantage of temperature records is it's not anecdotal. Okay, it's not anecdotal, it is a scientific way of collecting evidence. That's its key advantage. Also, temperature records are quite accurate, relative to the other methods. We're not estimating temperatures, we're not estimating, we're not have to be vague about whether something, whether conditions were moist or dry. Okay, we have actual numerical values for this data, so it's a bit more accurate. Okay, so, and these temperature records do span a significant amount of time, but the limitation is that they only go back about 200 to 300 years since people were measuring temperature and able to record them. So those records don't go back that much in time, and so they lose their usefulness in terms of measuring climate change over a significant period of time. Peat bogs, however, the key advantage is that data can go back as far as 12,000 years. So that's quite significant. And there's information on not just temperature, okay? Because from what we know about these species, we know a lot of things about the conditions that they like. So we know about the soil conditions that they prefer, the temperature, the humidity, those kind of things. We know quite a lot about the factors that they like, and so if we do see variations in their pollen levels over 12,000 years, we could get not just temperature information, but quite a lot of information about the changes in all those factors that must have been occurring over that period of time. Many of these advantages for peat bogs also apply to dendrochronology. However, dendrochronology has the advantage of more accurately predicting the time period over which the information can be applied. As we discussed, if you know the date, so you can use carbon dating, obviously, but that's an estimate. But if you know the date that a particular tree was cut, and the analysis, and you look at then the number of rings that are in that sample, you could then get quite an accurate prediction about the period of time that this tree ring sample can give you information about. Okay, so again, with both peat bogs and dendrochronology, there's one key disadvantage about these things, that we don't, it's again, where all the inferences that we do about the climatic conditions, they're basically just estimates and guesses. Okay, the other thing is that all those conditions that we're estimating, they weren't recorded with scientific equipment. So because they weren't recorded with scientific equipment, we don't really know. I mean, we can't really place any numerical value on those factors. In addition, I mean, the key thing that keeps coming up about this is that it's not just these climatic factors that affects their growth. So with regards to peat bogs and the amount of pollen, and with regards to dendrochronology and the thickness of the tree rings, there could be many factors which affected that. So how much pollen there was, or how thick these rings are, it's not just climatic factors that could be influencing that. There could be other factors that are affecting the thickness of the tree ring. Okay, for example, the quality of the soil, if any other thing apart from climatic changes occurred to affect that. And because we don't know what those other factors could have been, we can't really say that the variation in pollen and the variation in tree ring size was only due to the variation in climatic factors. So that's the pros and cons, the advantages and limitations of the three different ways of measuring climate change. Okay, so the one other way is ice cores that we talked about. Now, ice cores is similar in some ways to the analysis of peat bogs. In this case, you go to places where you can find ice sheets, like South Pole or something like that, and you take cores of ice from these ice sheets, and again, the depth of the cores indicates going back in time. But what you're doing with these cores is you are analyzing little bubbles of gas in these ice cores. Okay? And the further back in time you go, so for example, if I take this core right here, and I analyze the gas in these bubbles that I get from this ice, this gas that I might find in this bubble is the atmosphere, the atmospheric composition of ice that was formed hundreds, possibly thousands of years ago. And so I get an idea of the composition of gas at that time. And there's kind of many things you can infer from the kind of elemental or molecular composition of these gases from that time. You could estimate carbon dioxide levels, maybe methane. You can estimate the amount of greenhouse gases that there were in the air at the time. Other things also indicate temperature. So you can get a lot of information about climatic conditions from these ice core samples as well. So in the previous video, what we looked at was this idea that climate change affects ecosystems, and really the previous section was all about the evidence that can be used to say whether climate change has been happening. Okay, so the evidence for climate change. Okay, and in our specification, there is an emphasis on analyzing data. So there's likely to be lots, various different types of data that we'd have to analyze and come to the proper conclusions about what the limitations of the data are, what conclusions we can make from the data, and possibly even kind of criticizing the strength of the data itself. Okay, but anyway, in the previous section we discussed what those methods were. So there were 3 methods, which I'm not going to discuss right now. The 3 different ways of collecting evidence about climate change. The next section, 5.4, is in this section we'll talk about global warming. So that phenomenon is effectively like one possible mechanism by which climate change could be happening. Okay, and in the section that follows that, in this section itself, we discuss like climate change, global warming, and potentially the role of humans in climate change. So that's what this section is all about. Okay, let's begin. So it's very important to understand, first of all, the greenhouse effect. Now the greenhouse effect it's not bad, it's actually good. Okay, so the greenhouse effect, we've got to understand something about the Earth itself, that we have the Earth and we have the sun. Okay, and we get solar radiation from the sun, and it lights up one part and the other part is in the darkness, and the Earth is rotating. All of that business, that's fine. However, the thing about the Earth is that it's got liquid water. And one of the reasons why we are on this planet able to have living organisms and life is because we have living water. And the reason we have living water is, or at least one of the reasons, is the temperature of the Earth. It's not too hot that all the water would evaporate, and then therefore not be in a liquid state. It's not too cold that all that water would be in a solid state. So this is very important to understand, is that one of the reasons why the Earth is warm enough to have liquid water is, in fact, the greenhouse effect itself. So we have these atmospheric gases that surround the Earth. Okay, now what happens is that this solar radiation comes in towards the Earth. Some of it is reflected away from the Earth. Some of it is absorbed by the Earth, but then again it's kind of emitted out. So of the stuff that's reflected, okay, so some of it is reflected. Of the stuff that's absorbed, so actually gets to the surface of the Earth and is absorbed by the surface of the Earth, even some of that is emitted back out as infrared radiation. Okay? Now, if that was the only story, so if that was all that there was to it, the Earth would not be warm enough to have liquid water. It would be too cold. Okay? However, because we have atmospheric gases, and because some of these gases are greenhouse gases, of the infrared radiation that's going out towards space, some of this is absorbed by the greenhouse gases as the infrared radiation is on its way out into space from the Earth's surface. It's absorbed by the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and so it never gets back out into space. But what this does is, when the greenhouse gases absorb that infrared radiation, it results in a warming of the atmospheric gases. And this warming effect is what keeps the Earth warm enough to have liquid water and the temperature kind of just right for then, life to exist. Okay? And this is very important because then liquid water is what kind of distributes, the energy from the warm parts of the Earth to the colder parts of the Earth. So that, it prevents these drastic extremes of like the side of the Earth that's facing the sun getting too scorchingly hot versus the side of the Earth that's away from the sun during the night time getting too cold. Okay? So this is very important. And so what we need to, the take-home message is that the presence of this phenomenon of greenhouse gases and the warming of the planet because of the greenhouse gases fundamentally is not a bad negative process. So the greenhouse effect, you should understand, is very important for the survival of, or the existence of life on this planet and its continued survival. Okay, so let's just look at the mechanism of that. So let's just look at this. Apologies for the annotations already there. So what we have is we have energy coming in. Let's make that a bit bigger. We have energy coming in from the sun. Okay, right, so that's solar radiation. We can just refer to it as solar radiation. Some of that is reflected, so it never even gets to the surface of the Earth. So some of that goes out, right? So that's number one, energy comes in. Number two, some is reflected. Of the stuff that doesn't get reflected, it hits the Earth's surface and gets absorbed. But on its way, and then it's re-emitted back out. Okay? But on its way back out, it is emitted as infrared radiation. Infrared. So it's on its way out. And it goes back into space. Okay? However, on its way out, these greenhouse gases, they absorb some of that infrared radiation. And when they absorb that infrared radiation, it raises their temperature. Raising the temperature of the atmosphere, raising the global temperature. And that's what global warming is. Okay? Now, where does the negative part come in? The negative part comes in because of human activity, it is presumed, or it's kind of theorized that humans are causing an increase in these greenhouse gases. And because humans are causing an increase in the greenhouse gases, there's more greenhouse gases to absorb the infrared radiation. And so that leads to a kind of artificial, unnatural, if you will, increase in the temperature. Okay? So, fundamentally the greenhouse effect is not bad. It's just a human contribution to kind of exacerbate it, possibly. That is the thing that needs to be kept in check. Okay? Because remember, all the species of life on Earth, they're adapted to their particular environment. That environment has a particular temperature, and all these conditions is what the organisms have adapted to. Now, if we suddenly and quite dramatically change these temperatures, okay, if we change these temperatures, it no longer matches the adaptation of the organisms. Those organisms are no longer adapted to the new climatic conditions, and so it's going to affect their survival and it's going to affect their abundance. Okay, so this is the idea. So you need to understand the greenhouse effect, and you need to be able to describe it step by step, as I did there, in about 5 to 6 points, less, if possible. Okay. So human kind of impact on this. So the idea is that greenhouse gases are those which can absorb the infrared energy. Remember, infrared energy that's on its way out from the Earth. Okay, I want to not see anybody make the straightforward assumption that global warming is simply energy from space being absorbed by the atmosphere. That's too straightforward. It's not how it works. So please make sure that you understood this process that I discussed here. Anyway, the greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, and chlorofluorocarbons. Okay, these are greenhouse gases, nitrous oxides. These are the greenhouse gases. And, these were naturally, kind of present in the atmosphere anyway. However, human activity has caused, presumably, as the argument goes, that human activity has increased the amount of these greenhouse gases, and so there's more greenhouse gases to absorb the infrared radiation that otherwise would have gone into space. Okay, and this is resulting in an unnatural increase in the atmospheric temperature. Okay, so that's the kind of human input into that story, and we need to understand that. So next is just a kind of list of a few human activities that we theorize are resulting in the increased greenhouse gas levels. Okay, so things like in the Industrial Revolution, which kind of, there was a lot of combustion, driving the energy demands of these factories and so on, burning fossil fuels, incomplete combustion, the increased electrical usage of households and, factories and so on, chemical industry producing chemicals, increasing the proportion of chlorofluorocarbons. All these things are human activities which are resulting in or which could explain increases in the amounts of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Okay, so we finish with this idea, and this idea kind of has its roots in year one Edexcel biology, that correlation is all well and good. Correlation is not the same as causation. And this is where the debate on climate change and the human involvement in climate change, this is where it's kind of stuck. Because though people can show correlations between carbon dioxide levels and temperature, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is the cause of the other. It could be the other way around. So that's where, and that takes us to the next part, because what that means is that there's kind of two sides of the fence here. On one side, you can believe that, and very reasonably, you can believe that human activity is causing an increase in greenhouse gases, which you might feel is enough evidence to suggest that humans are the cause of the global temperature increase. On the other side of the fence, you could argue that actually the causation has not been proved, and because the causation has not been proved, you can't for certain say that humans are the cause of the global temperature increase. And that takes us to the next bit, which is kind of dealing with controversy. So and that's what controversy means, is that two alternative views can reasonably be held. Like you could argue one case and you could just as easily argue the other case, and they could both be reasonably convincing to a regular person. Okay, and that's where we are currently. And it's very important for scientists to be able to kind of put themselves beyond the general kind of media circus surrounding all these things. The media breaks information down, maybe twists it, maybe from their point of view they're just kind of simplifying it, but in actual fact they could be misrepresenting the facts. So as a scientist, you should be able to go to the source and make a decision for yourself based on that. And some people don't have that luxury, but as a scientist you could say, well, I'm not decided yet, I'm not certain, the facts have not convinced me either way. people in positions where they're in government, they don't have that luxury. They kind of have to decide one way or another, which kind of puts them in a difficult position because they have to take action in either way. Okay, but that's what controversy is. It's basically being able to hold two alternative views quite reasonably, but then you can't just say, well, that's controversial, full stop. You have to be able to then judge the evidence on either side. Maybe it is the case that the evidence on one side is stronger than the other side. Okay, so as a scientist, you need to be able to look at data. You need to be able to, first of all, you need to be able to look past the media and be able to have the confidence to go to the data and analyze the data for yourself and come to your conclusions. Second, you need to be able to look at the quality of the data and make that judgment about whether the data is reliable. In terms of the source of the data, where is this information coming from? Is it a person in their bedroom doing a blog, or is it an expert in the field who's been working on this for many years? You've got to be able to judge the reliability of the sources, and you also have to be able to look at the data itself and look at the scientific setup of investigations to decide whether data is reliable, is it accurate, are the conclusions valid? These are the challenges for a scientist. Okay, just a bit on this. Ethical considerations, I think it mainly revolves around this idea that industrialization has been a force for a lot of good in the world. Okay, it's resulted in kind of improved quality of life, improved health, better standard of living, like generally across in populations. So industrialization has had a lot of benefits. But what's driven industrialization, what's kind of powered it, is unfortunately consumption and burning of vast amounts of fossil fuels. Now, what we have to also consider is that some countries are still going through their process of industrialization. And when countries, admit, or maybe they decide that actually maybe the whole world needs to switch to renewable sources of energy, well, that might not be fair on countries that have not gone through their industrialization process yet. And it might not even be possible for certain countries who don't have the means to generate these alternative energy resources, because they are actually more expensive than fossil fuels, the renewable energies, at the moment. Okay, so the ethical considerations is around kind of, can you really ask all the countries in the world to sign up to the same agreements when actually they're all in very different circumstances? Some countries have gone through their industrialization. They maybe have kind of built up an infrastructure in their country, resources in their country that will allow them to maybe more smoothly transition to renewable. So the next section is about being able to predict. So based on the collection of data, it's about predicting future climate. So the story really is evidence of climate change, human, how humans have impact on the climate, so human impact on climate, and that's the greenhouse. It's the greenhouse effect. And then the next bit is, if humans do continue as they are, or if the current trends continue, what's going to happen in the future? So predicted climate change. So this is really the section about climate change. So this is the last bit about climate change itself. Okay, so really what we're basing this on is saying, right, until this point we've got X amount of data, and based on the data we can fit a trend line. Okay, so that's until the present. So this point in time, that's the present. Now, based on the data that we have, can we predict what's going to happen in the future? That's essentially what people do with the collection of data. However, the thing about the data on climate change is it's not as easy as a kind of straight line graph that we can see here. Climate change data is more like what you can see here. So obviously there's a pattern here. There's a pattern here, you know, advanced kind of analysts and mathematicians could fit a graph to this and then use that to predict. But that's kind of, you know, very advanced extrapolation. But, you know, we can use the principle of a straight line to kind of explain the idea of what extrapolation is. But really, the kind of extrapolation that's being done is what you can see down here. So if that's the pattern up to present, what's going to happen in the future? Okay, so what is extrapolation? So extrapolating is essentially what we've just discussed. We've got a series of points, and from those series of points we can fit a relationship, i.e. the line of best fit, and then we assume that the line of best fit, that pattern is going to continue, and if it does so, we can then start to predict. We can start to predict the values that we might get from numbers that we have not collected yet. Okay, so, you know, these data points, all this, we have the data for that. Yeah, but beyond that line, we are extrapolating. Right, beyond that line we are extrapolating, but you need enough data to make that relationship in the first place. Okay. Now, assumptions is very important. Now, apologies for the visibility here, but basically I'm trying to make the point here that if you have data that's a trend like this, it's easy to fit. You know, you can be quite confident in the relationship between x and y in graph A, because the lines, you know, the data fits a very easy to see pattern, and therefore we can be very confident in our line of best fit when we have such data. And when we can be confident in our line of best fit, we can then be more confident about the quality of our extrapolation. Okay? And so on. So these points, if they're in the future, I'd be confident that my predictions, you know, will pretty much be correct, because of the strength of the data that I used to, or the type of data, the type of pattern, the type of relationship. However, look down here at, you know, graph B. Let's look at this data. So this data, slightly different. Okay, so I've got point A. You know, the first, I've got these data points. These are the experimental data that I've collected. Now, based on this, it'll be very difficult for me to say where this pattern is going to go in the future. Okay, as you can see here, it could go like that, it possibly could go like that, or it could go like that, all within reason. So I hope you can see that, you know, the extrapolation that you can do is very limited by the data that you have collected. Very limited, totally dependent on that. Okay. So there's a number of assumptions that we have to have then. This is very important. Assumption number one is that, yes, that we have collected enough data for us to be able to make a prediction. Okay, so let's go back to the first graph. What if we had only collected these 3 points? What if our data was only these 3 points? Would we be confident to fit a line of best fit to that data and then make a trend based on that? What if I only had the first 2 points? So let's get rid of that. If I had to fit a line of best fit to the first 3 points, then in that case my line of best fit would look something like that. Okay, clearly not along the same trajectory as what I had if I took all the points into account. And the more points I have, the more reliable my line of best fit. Okay, so our first assumption is that we have enough data to fit a model on. So this line is what we would refer to as our model. That's the relationship we think there exists between x and y. Okay, that's the line. And the second assumption is that whatever patterns that we've seen so far are going to exist in the future. It's the same pattern, okay? Which might not be the case, you know. Humans and their activity might be changing the patterns as they have been up until now. So the more factors that we take into account, the more accurate our predictions may be. Okay, so which takes us to our next point, which is there's a lot of factors that affect the relationship between x and y. Okay. So if I had a simple x equals y relationship, it would be very straightforward. But some relationships are a bit more complicated than that. Sometimes your relationship might be 2 times x equals y, in which case, you know, your line goes like that. Sometimes it might be y equals 2x plus 1. Okay, in which case I would have an intercept right there. So my graph would look like that. Okay, now I'm not a mathematician, so I can't draw more complex graphs than that. However, you know, some graphs have a bit more, they have a few more variables that are involved. Now, these graphs that I've drawn here are very simple. They're just relationships between x and y, and there's a constant factor in there. But other graphs have more variables, and the more complicated graphs get, as you can see, like this, if you had a graph like this, there's probably a mathematical relationship that relates x to y on this very, you know, complicated relationship. But there is an equation that relates x to y, and that probably includes many factors. And the principle is that the more factors that could be affecting the relationship between x and y, the more factors that you take into account, that you account for in your modeling, the more likely you are to find an equation that closely reflects the changes that you're seeing. Okay, and what that means for our purposes is that the more factors, like the level of aerosols that people are using, you know, what's been the cloud cover patterns over the years, have there been any variations in solar radiation over time? The more factors you take into account, the more accurate your modeling can be. Okay, so what prevents our models to be accurate? Well, our data only goes so far back, as we've seen in section 5.3. So we have limited data on which to base the model. Okay, we don't have complete understanding of how climate systems work. Okay, our computing resources, even though kind of moving ahead at a fantastic pace, we still haven't developed the kind of power that we'd need to factor in all the variables that it would take to kind of be able to accurately predict weather. We don't know all the factors that affect the climate still. Okay, and as we've said, changing trends. Okay, so whatever the relationship was before humans arrived, that's probably not the exact same relationship that there exists now with the addition of the human activity and all its impacts. So all these things affects how good modeling can be, and therefore it's difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future in terms of climate change. That brings us to the end of our discussion about climate change, at least in terms of climate change itself. Now we look at the impact of climate change on biological organisms. Okay,